Hello and welcome to a special broadcast on YouTube. I'm gonna give it 30 seconds or so to allow people to join. It's now 3 o'clock BST, British Summer Time. So in the UK, it's the middle of the afternoon. I'm in London. It's rather sunny now, but we've had quite a bit of rain on and off. It's quite unpredictable weather here. But we do normally get viewers from right around the world. So I think people will be in America probably waking up or quite early. And then other times around the world. So I'll give it sort of to 1 minute past. I mean, it's 1 minute past already. I'll give it another 20 seconds or so to make sure people who want to be here from the beginning are here. So bear with me while I have a drink and then we'll get started. It was quite good to check that no one's emailed to say you're not live. I think we are live. We have some viewers anyway. So we might as well get started, hadn't we? Okay, welcome to this very special broadcast brought to you by Orchard OCD, the OCD charity, and hosted by Made of Millions. So we are on their platform, and Orchard OCD, which I will explain a little bit about, are the people sort of bringing this broadcast to you. I am Sean Fletcher. I'm a broadcaster here in the UK. So if you watch telly in the UK, you may have seen me on programs like Countryfile on the BBC or Good Morning Britain on ITV and other BBC programs like Songs of Praise and Sunday Morning Live. So I am on telly here in the UK. Believe me, if you don't live in the UK, you may not have seen me. Otherwise, you may have seen me on things like, other webinars like this. Orchard do quite a few webinars with eminent people in the world of OCD, and that is what we're going to be doing today. So just to tell you a little bit about Orchard, the charity, we are a charity that is searching for new ways to treat OCD. So we know that the go-to sort of treatment when you have OCD and you present to a medical professional is SSRI, so antidepressants. You'll be given a high dose of antidepressants, and that has been proven to sort of bring down the noise of OCD. And then when you have therapy, normally CBT with ERP, so exposure response prevention in that. So it's basically talking therapy. That's more effective because the noise of the OCD has been brought down. However, we know that is effective for about 50 to 60% of people who have OCD, which is very good. 60 million people in the UK, between 2 and 3% of the population, of any population, have obsessive compulsive disorder. So just do the maths. We're talking about nearly 2 million people, 1.5 million people just in the UK. And if you can treat half of them with that, it's really effective. However, that means there are about, roughly 40 to 50% of people who have OCD and go for treatment. And that go-to treatment is not effective. So what Orchard OCD want to do is give medical professionals, clinicians, an armory of products, of treatments that they can use. So it may be deep brain stimulation. It may be psilocybin, which is one of the trials that we are funding at Orchard. And it may be, say, something like Tolcapone, which is what we're going to be talking about today. Just to sort of give you a bit of a background for me, so I'm not just a broadcaster, I'm also a mental health campaigner. I do these webinars for Orchard OCD. And one of the reasons I have been brought to the world of OCD is my son has OCD. He was very ill when he was about 13. He's 20 now. He's in a much better place. But through those years, my wife and I have seen how OCD can destroy families. It can destroy lives. And that's why I feel passionate about this area and about making it, just giving medical professionals more tools to treat OCD. So let's get straight into it. So Tolcapone is one of the latest studies that we at Orchard are funding. The study is being undertaken by the University of Chicago. The man at the heart of that is Professor Jon E. He is leading the trial, and hopefully I'll be able to get him into the conversation now. Here we are. John, good to see you. Thanks very much for joining us.
It's absolutely my pleasure.
So you're in Chicago, so it's morning. So I really appreciate you joining us fairly early. What is it, 9 o'clock?
9 a.m. It's a lovely morning here. So.
Okay. So I've done a bit of a spiel about what Orchard does. I've touched on Tolcapone. Can you tell us initially what is Tolcapone?
Yeah, no, so I appreciate your introduction. So tolcapone is actually an old medication, been around for decades, used to treat Parkinson's disease of all things. And never was really used that much because it was actually never a particularly useful medication for Parkinson's. But some researchers over the years have found out that in non-Parkinson's people, the way tolcapone works in the brain is to help increase a chemical called dopamine, specifically in the frontal part of the brain, where we make decisions, where we have our choices of whether to focus on something or shift our focus away from things. And it's a unique medication that is really the only one that affects that chemical in that part of the brain. And so people have looked at it over the last probably 15 years for a variety of things unrelated to Parkinson's. And the way it worked mechanistically to help with these kind of cognitive aspects of how we think through problems, we thought it might be beneficial for OCD. So we did a small study that we funded ourselves, looking at it in a small number of folks. And we saw this sort of nice little signal, we'll call it, that it seemed to actually help some folks. And that's why we then wanted to do a larger study, scientifically well constructed, so that we could compare it to a placebo as an option for OCD.
So when you say it showed signs that it could help, what do you mean? As in the same way that SSRIs do, it brought down the noise of OCD, or it did something else?
It brought down the noise of OCD. It actually did two things. It brought down the noise of the obsessional thoughts. Those were decreased. And at the same time, the need to engage in compulsive ritual behavior also decreased.
Okay. So that was a very small sample. You sort of had a clue, you had an inkling.
Yeah, it was a very small study. Quite frankly, because it was sort of funded on our own dime, we had to keep it sort of short and sweet, so to speak, just to see if we could find something. And so we kept it to 2 weeks of treatment. Now, as you highlight, people need SSRIs at higher doses, often for a full 12-week trial to see if they work. But we wanted just to see if just using a little bit of this for a short period of time, we could notice that we were moving in the right direction. And so after just 2 weeks of taking it, it was able to bring down the noise compared to a placebo.
Okay, just to point out to viewers, please do get your questions in. I'll try and get to as many of them as possible. These webinars always work best when we have a lot more involvement from you. So get your questions in. I'll talk about the study and tolcapone for a bit, and then we'll try and come to you. So don't worry, they won't be ignored, but we will try sort of halfway through to get to loads of questions. So John, why do you think it was helping with patients of OCD? We know it does help. It works as an effective treatment for Parkinson's. What was it doing the same sort of things, or is it something completely different?
Completely different, it seems. And so even when it's been given to folks, healthy control people, just a single dose to see what it does in the brain, what it tends to do is improve what we would call cognitive flexibility. So our ability not to sit and fixate on something, but to shift away from it, right? I mean, we all need to be somewhat flexible. So if you're driving home and you drive home the same way every evening, every night, but tonight, big signs say, bridge washed out, turn around, danger, danger. You are most likely flexible enough that you say, okay, I need to take a different route home. Many folks with OCD have a certain rigidity of thinking. Once they get into a track of OCD, they have to do the same thing over and over again, think through the issue over and over again in the same pattern. And this is the behavior that, the cognitive aspect that tolcapone seemed to improve, this ability to be more flexible, to not fixate on something.
So I just thinking about, so I haven't got OCD. Would it affect me? Is it something that only affects people who are very rigid, or is tolcapone something that would work on, would have an effect on other people? I'm just trying to think what it's doing.
Yeah, so I think very anxious people can get quite rigid, and I would argue too. I mean, OCD it's as we all are very much aware, a horrific illness for people. But a lot of folks have aspects of OCD, right? I mean, so you can get very fixated on something if you are, looking for a new job, and every night you're thinking, am I going to get it? Am I going to get it? Right. And you're perseverating on something. It could potentially help shift that, right? Because our brain is developed to think about things. And in all sorts of people and disorders, we have different levels of flexibility.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I'm not saying people who don't have OCD should have it, but I just trying to get that idea. So I'm the sort of person who would, I don't do this so much now, but would leave the house, go to the station, think, did I lock the door? Did I lock the door? I haven't got OCD, but it's an obsessive, it's something, the sort of anxiety, the checking. I sort of get what Tolcapone would be doing. How do you go about starting to know what dose people should have? So you know it works for Parkinson's. Do you just suddenly think, well, I've got an inkling this is going to work with OCD? Do you use the same dosage that you would with Parkinson's?
So that's a great question. So one of the things that I think most psychiatrists do, because we use things what are called off-label, right? So if I have a patient who is struggling with OCD and the approved medications aren't doing enough, then we often use things that are not approved from a regulatory purpose, as long as the person knows the risks and benefits. And so using the medication in my clinic setting with a few people, I started noticing that people were telling me, even at starting doses of it, they'd say, I think I'm thinking a little bit differently now. I just feel a little, they'll describe it as kind of my thoughts are less sticky. I just don't I can kind of think about other things when I have to and not just perseverate on whatever my obsession is. And I was noticing that at low doses, and that was important. And I was thankful because Tolcapone does come with a sort of what we'd call a black box warning, at least in the United States, which the Food and Drug Administration came out with and said may cause some liver problems. And so we need to take that quite seriously. And that's at a certain dose that a couple people, when it came out for Parkinson's, had liver failure on it. So it's not a harmless medication in that way. It could potentially have some issues. Out of thousands and thousands of people, it's a very low chance of having that problem. But I wanted to see if we could see a benefit and avoid that problem. So our first little study, and now the larger study that we're launching, is using a lower dose than was associated with problems. Because, God only knows, right? You don't want a solution to raise its own new problems for people. So, so I'm hoping, therefore, we can avoid any liver issues by using a dose that has not been associated with liver problems.
Yeah, and that was going to be my next question. We were talking about it. It sounds like a wonder drug. It's doing, for someone with OCD, this is perfect. But there are side effects.
Yep.
And actually, Margarita Zanoni has, let me see if I can put that question up there, has asked that question. Are there any side effects? So you talk about liver. So let's just deal with that first. That sounds like if you have issues with your liver, that's quite serious. Is it that if you already have issues with your liver, so you might be a drinker, or is it could affect anyone?
It could affect anyone. And so if somebody's using the medication, and we're doing this quite religiously in the study, we're checking the liver every 2 weeks while the person is sort of getting adjusted to the medication. And you can take a little blood from the arm and see if the liver is getting irritated. And I would say that your liver would be irritated, as you highlight. If you went out and had a couple beers tonight and I took your test tomorrow, it could be a little irritated. But if we notice anything based on the medication, that's when we just want to stop it and tell people, we're not going to risk anybody's health over, a clinical trial, for goodness sakes. So.
Okay. So in the trial, if you're having Tolcapone, you are being monitored. Your liver is being monitored. So that's perfectly safe. Later down the line, if this is rolled out, that's something that would be an issue, and something but what you're doing is aiming for a low enough dose that doesn't affect the liver, but also that has effects on the OCD.
Exactly. And in our first study, which was smaller, we saw, at the low dose, we didn't see any liver issues. And so, and other people who've looked at it for a variety of issues haven't found that either if they use lower doses.
Okay. So let's just deal with some of the other things that Margarita asking about the main side effects. We know about the liver. Are there other side effects that we would need to be aware of?
Really, there are not major side effects. What we've seen is maybe a little bit of upset tummy, some nausea that people get when they start it. People can feel a little dizzy when they start it, but these are all very mild. And quite frankly, we see that in the folks who take placebo too. Yeah. So we haven't seen anything else big or problematic showing up in the studies.
Okay. Lisa Hodges says, what is the dose you use? You said you're starting a low amount and you sort of work it out. What is in the trial? What's being used?
So what we have found beneficial is we started 100 milligram pill twice a day, breakfast and supper. And after a couple of weeks, if people tolerate it well, meaning that they are not having any liver issues and they're not having any upset stomach, then it goes to 200 twice a day. So that's a total of 400 milligrams. In the studies that showed some liver problems when it was used in Parkinson's, it was used at 600 milligrams or higher. But we are keeping it to 400 or even arguably lower if people do very well at the starting dose.
So John, are we saying that there were no cases of liver problems on that dose, or there are no known cases of liver problems on that dose?
There are no known cases of liver problems at that dose. But because there are the liver problems that did occur were really quite rare and sort of unexpected, we still monitor the liver at all doses because we don't want to be cavalier about any problems that people could develop.
Okay, quite a few questions coming in. We don't, John. We don't normally get so many questions early on. You must be very popular. So Nick has messaged in to say, how long does it take for the drug to have an effect on reducing OCD symptoms? You said 2 weeks for that first trial, which sounds very quick. Is that across the board?
Well, it's interesting that yes, we did start seeing some gradual decrease in obsessive thinking in the rituals after just 2 weeks. So now this is why we wanted to do a longer study, right? We were looking for some sort of quicker signal. And I should say in some of the early studies of SSRIs, they even noticed some benefit after 2 weeks, not full benefit, but they noticed some benefit after 2 weeks. So now doing an 8-week study, we're going to be able to see whether optimal benefit happens 3-4 weeks or takes a full 8 weeks, or we're going to get that better information about when people might be expecting something. But we're very much aware that, again, people, this is where we kind of balance. I hope that we can see benefits quickly. Everybody wants something quickly, and the reality is when people have lived with OCD, it's horrific, and people have just want it over. And I hope we can see something that happens quickly for a majority of people. But if it doesn't, and it still hits at, say, 6 weeks, and it's still a nice effect, I would say that could still be a viable alternative option when people don't get enough benefit from SSRIs.
Okay. I've got a question from Lisa, which I'll come to in a minute. So Lisa Hodges, who sent one of the other questions in. I just want to start talking a bit more in detail about the trial. So how many patients do you have? You've said it's 8 weeks already. You've said that. Are there any other details that we need to know just to sort of get a broad idea of what's happening in the trial? So
it's going to be about 85 people, which is a good I would, for the folks who care about statistics, well-powered study. So that means if it doesn't pan out with 85 people, we know that it's not just some statistical sleight of hand that didn't work. So it should show us if it's going to work in that number of people. And it will also be a large enough study that we want to be able to look at not only if it works or not, right? I mean, this is the thing about medications is most people now know even the best treatments work in some people and not others. But by getting up 85 people, what we're also hoping is, let's say it works better than a placebo. We also want to know what are the unique qualities about the people that it worked in and not the others, right? Does it work better in certain obsessions? Would contamination work better than, say, taboo obsessions? Would younger people respond better than older people? Blah, you can kind of go on and on with the list. And so we want to look at some major predictors to see who might benefit more than somebody else, to kind of tailor it.
And that ties in with what I was saying right at the beginning, which is what we're passionate about at Orchard, is having an armory, giving clinicians an armory of medications and treatments. So if you're saying that, if, for example, Tolcapone works better with people who have contamination issues, that would be a go-to for someone who has to, if a clinician is confronted with someone with contamination issues. And that's something that actually really surprised me. I mean, I don't know a great deal about cancer treatment, but when I was thrown into this OCD world with my son, how little we know about those things, because I know in cancer treatment has come on huge leaps and bounds within the last 20, 30 years, where they do target things and they do know a lot more about, certain treatments for certain people and certain cancers.
Yeah, I guess my fallback position about that is the brain is just probably the most complicated thing in the universe, right? And so it's going to unlock its mystery slowly. Having said that, we don't really know why certain medications work for some people and not others. And yet, thank goodness, they work for some people, right? So we can kind of be, quite optimistic about things. The other thing we're doing in this, and what's kind of fascinating about Tolcapone, is that, and it's not my finding, but other people have found that you can actually see genotypes. So there are certain ways that we break down dopamine in the front part of our brain, and that's what Tolcapone works on. And depending on your genotype, meaning what sort of genes that you have breaking down dopamine, Tolcapone may work better on some than others. And so what we're also getting as part of this is we're having people spit in a cup for us. It's so simple. They spit, and then we can analyze the saliva to see what their genotype is. So ideally, right, this is where science would love to go, kind of like the cancer treatment. But if Tolcapone is beneficial, then the next question would be, is it beneficial in a certain genotype? So that I could say to you, listen, you've got bad OCD. I'm sorry to hear that. You're interested in Tolcapone. Here, spit for me. And if your genotype is a certain way, I can say, you know what? You've got a darn good chance that this drug would work. If it looks a different way, I would say, let's not even waste your time. We'll try plan B instead, because it may not be the way your brain is set up just may not be the appropriate one for this drug.
That's fascinating. Wow.
Yeah. And so we're hoping to kind of make inroads. And again, 85 people in a study should allow us at least to start, really kind of breaking that down in a better, useful way. Because right now with SSRIs, there are 6 of them or so, right, depending on the jurisdiction. And if number 1 doesn't work, we just try number 2 and then number 3. And everybody is sort of saying, be patient, but the person with OCD has to be patient. And yet they go home every night and they're riddled with obsessions. And so the clinicians, we say, be patient, but it's sort of it's night and day from what the poor person who has OCD has to struggle with daily. So,
yeah. And just to add to that, what is it, about 3 months you have to have a certain type of SSRI to be sure that it doesn't work or it does work. So you think each one of those 3 months, and it takes 3 months to come off. That's years. If it's the 5th SSRI that has a little bit of an effect, you're waiting such a long time just to know.
They are.
And how do you know? I mean, maybe your OCD just goes through a better patch when you have a certain SSRI for other reasons.
Seriously.
So this whole idea of actually being very targeted and being able to check out people's genotype and say it's going to work, it's more likely to work for you, it's not going to work for you. That sort of blows my mind, and that's great. That's exactly what we want to be doing.
And having said that, though, I will say that what we know, ironically, is with the person with the SSRIs, the first 5 might not work, and the 6th one hits, right? And which is baffling too, but it does. And so I always want people to be patient, because that's kind of just, unfortunately, right now, the state of our science.
Yeah.
But I hope that in time we can do better, not just for OCD, but this is the case for all mental health problems. Depression has the same problem too.
So let's just think about, 85 people. So the first person comes in, what do you do with them? So you give them some throughout the course, they'll have some Tolcapone, so 100 milligrams, you were saying morning and evening, and then you will raise that to 200 milligrams morning and evening on the 4th week, 5th week.
Yep.
4th week. Okay. If it's not affecting them in a bad way, you give them placebo for some of that time. You will also get them to spit in a cup. What other things are they doing and you monitoring?
So what we're also having them do, and again, because our theory here is that it is changing flexibility, they are actually sitting down and doing a battery of what would be called cognitive tasks. They play little computer games that actually track to different circuits of the brain that are created by the good people in the UK at Cambridge University that have developed these cognitive tasks over the last 30 years. And they will do those at the beginning and then at the end of the study, because that will also give us another objective measure of when they say, yeah, I think I'm better, then we'll be able to say, on this task of this type of cognition, planning, executive functioning, cognitive flexibility, you actually got better, and we could actually then be able to see improvement on the task that we're hoping would coincide with simply symptom improvement as well.
So how do you record the results? How do you record success? What would be success in a patient?
So success in a patient historically and throughout all drug trials has been a measure, a clinician measure, meaning we talk to the patient and basically they're telling us how much time they're obsessing, how much those obsessions are getting in the way, how much control they have over their obsessions. And then they also answer those same types of questions about their compulsions. It's a scale that's been used. It's called the Y box. Everybody in the OCD world kind of knows about it. It's been used now for decades. And we are able to see improvement over time on that scale. And there is a measure if people do tend to get like a 35% reduction in that scale, that coincides with what patients have described as an improvement in their lives too. So that's what we sort of set as our standard for an improvement for any type of treatment.
And also you throwing in you were saying the computer
so those
tasks.
Yes, and we'll be able to sort of see those are the scores are measured on the computer task, how quickly they're able to divert their attention. And then at the end of the trial, we'll also be able to see if they're able to change, say, their focus even quicker than they were before. So,
and so if one person in the 85 has improved OCD, that's not the success. But if 50 do, that's a success. What's the threshold?
So yes, so it's a little bit to do with sort of pooling the mean. So out of 85 people, roughly half will be on placebo, half will be on Tolcapone. And we see those two groups, how those two groups differed over the course of the trial. So if everybody got better on Tolcapone, but everybody got better on placebo, then it's not really that we'd recommend the medication, as the approach. Folks with OCD, interestingly enough, generally have a fairly low placebo response because, sometimes life events, say in depression, can modify your depression. But OCD tends to be so much hardwired problem that just, having people come in and chat for a few minutes doesn't help them unless they're really changing the brain. So
I see. So I'm trying to sort of get my head around it. So there are many people with depression. I mean, this is a real generalization, is it? But with depression, you could just have a good day and work, and that can actually have an effect on your depression. And if you're doing some sort of monitoring of it, that can have an effect on it. But with OCD, it's sort of entrenched. It tends to have a grip on you.
More entrenched. I mean, seriously, depression is a serious illness.
Yeah, of course.
You can have some fluctuations. And depression often doesn't last. I mean, a depressive episode may only last a couple of weeks. For a lot of people, they're severely depressed, but then they kind of come out of it. Whereas OCD doesn't tend to have that 2 or 3 weeks of being really obsessive and then no symptoms. We just don't see the level of fluctuation in OCD.
So I did say that I was going to get to Lisa Hodges' question. Lisa, I wasn't forgetting you, honestly. It basically ties in with what we're talking about. Were there any people who did not respond at all? I mean, you're doing the study at the moment, so you don't really have all the results, do you?
No, we don't. But even in our small study, there were people who didn't respond. I mean, there always are. And I think that's that's where some of these measures and predictors become incredibly important. Because let's say 2/3 of the people on Tolcapone get better. I would think of that as quite a success. But it still tells me what's different about those third of people who aren't responding, right? They're not responding to SSRIs, they're not responding to X, Y, or Z. And so we do need to understand as much as we can what's unique about those people. Is it that they have some co-occurring problems that are conflicting? Are they, is it just a more severe type of OCD? So this is why when people come in for any study, we get a ton of all these measures and people are like, why are you asking me all this other stuff? It's just about my OCD. And we're trying to paint a massive picture of the person because all parts of our psyche interact, don't they? I mean, the way we're raised, our living situation, all these. So can we look at other variables that also may tell us, well, if so-and-so just didn't seem to respond, what's different about that person or that person's life or that person's something that may tell us that we need to then, the next study or the next one, need to focus on those folks who really have what we'd call more treatment refractory OCD that just doesn't seem to respond to anything ever. I mean, we can always do better. Right.
Treatment resistant OCD, and then there's another stage which is treatment refraction OCD. That's even
yes, it's even more. I mean, it doesn't. Nothing makes a dent, even, it seems. And so, we always need to do more for folks, and we see that again with all mental health problems, right? Some people's depression has never responded to anything. Some people's anxiety has never responded to anything. And while we can then sort of say, look, we've got some great treatment here for something, we still need to be mindful. There are always a chunk of people who continue to struggle. The best science we have all the time, and we can't ignore that because they may hold the clues to also the sort of the depth of the illness. But we also don't want people to struggle like that forever. I mean, it's just horrific.
Yeah. So people who are on the trial, they have treatment resistant OCD. They have tried other forms of treatment. Is that right?
Other forms of treatment. And some may not. So we are enrolling people that have not had other types of treatment for OCD as well, if they want to be in the study too. We would suggest to those folks to get an SSRI instead, but we will probably have some in the study. We've made it so that we can also look at it as maybe an alternative to SSRIs, not just for the people who have failed things. So.
I'm going to talk a bit about people, the audience and people's involvement. But while I do that, do remember to send your questions in. We can get as many questions as we can to Professor Jon Grant. As I said, these webinars are always better when they're shaped by you. I can ask questions for 2 or 3 hours, but actually it's quite nice if it comes from you. So please do send your questions in. I'll try and get to as many as I can. And on that, you're in the University of Chicago, of course. If people are in the Chicago area and they think, I want to help, yeah. Are you still enrolling, and how do they get in touch?
They can call me, email me. I'm always here. So
it's easy to find your email on the University of Chicago
website. Yep. And always happy to talk to people about the study to see if they're interested, etc.
Do they need to be off SSRIs for sort of 3 months or so, or can they be on treatment now?
Current medications, as long as those are stable. We don't want them on medications that they're modifying and going up and down with and then starting this. And that's only because then if they got better, we wouldn't know if it's the Tolcapone or it's the other thing that they've been going up and down on. So we just ask them for the period of the 8 weeks to keep their pills where they are.
But you need someone who is probably not getting as much as they would like out of the current medication that they're on.
Of course, yes.
Yeah. So we get to the end of these 8 weeks, and 2/3, let's say, for example, 2/3 of people have had a really dramatic improvement. It's, you're celebrating. You've got the team together. You're having a glass of champagne. You're saying, "We did it. Tolcapone is the way forward for lots of people." What are the next steps? Because many academics you speak to would be really pleased with having a paper that their peers can see and their peers really, really respect. But there'll be people who have OCD who are struggling with treatment resistant OCD, and they will think, "Well, but we need that for us. Would this be rolled out to people if it's successful?
So yeah, I would say if it's successful or not, we'll always publish our results. I mean, I think people need to know when things don't work as well. But if it's successful, it is available. As I said, it's generic. It's been around forever. I would say in the United States, we have a little bit different system, of course, right? Insurance probably would not give it to people who don't have Parkinson's. But sometimes insurance can be pressured to give things to people when they see some scientific evidence. So if we have something that then doctors can send to the insurance and say, look, there actually is a study that showed this was helpful for folks, then they could get it covered by insurance. But even without the coverage piece, it's available by prescription. So it could be used in somebody who has OCD once the person knows if it's actually any good or not. The other piece about this is that I think scientifically, right, because one of the perhaps rate limiting steps of this will be, let's say we also find nobody has a liver issue, which, I'm hoping will be the case and that everybody will be safe throughout the whole study. But it still might come with a certain fear or anxiety about that. So what I would hope ultimately is that this scientific evidence could be used by some nerdy little scientist someplace to create maybe a new drug for OCD based on this mechanism in the brain, the way it works in the front part of the brain, but that you could then make sure it's really ultra safe for the rest of the body, right? That you would refine Tolcapone in a way that you get the benefits knowing that it can work for OCD without the detriments.
I see. So we're talking about in 10 years time, someone saying we've got this amazing drug, and it's refined Tolcapone, and the University of Chicago lit the spark or whatever, that they were the beginnings of this, but actually there's a journey for Tolcapone to go on, and this is the beginning of it.
Yes, and I would say that might be, and that's where I think of science as building incrementally on itself, right?
Yeah. But
what we want is no one study is the be all end all, right? It doesn't. No, I mean, and patients should know that. No one study tells them that this is the perfect anything in terms of treatment and that they should race out and get it. There will always be risks and benefits that one has to weigh. And as we said, it may not work for everybody who tries it. But successful trials can add to our scientific knowledge so that we at least start thinking about directions, right? We've been in the serotonin direction for decades now. And essentially we have sort of repetitive serotonin drugs. And so as you had mentioned, psilocybin and other options, right? We need to think, are there other avenues that one can take chemically that might give bigger sort of benefit, to folks with OCD. And so if this doesn't work out, that's good. That's good for people to know that too. And then we might, in scientific flexibility, right, then need to go a different route.
Yeah, it's interesting. You talk about we've been on a sort of SSRI route for many years now, and the new drug is another SSRI. And I always thought, and correct me if I'm wrong, as a layperson looking from the outside, I always thought that was because big pharmaceutical companies, that's sort of where they make their profit, because they sort of adjust something and they can sell it big and they can patent it. This is a little bit different, isn't it, with Tolcapone?
Yeah.
Can you explain a bit about that? Because it's not something you can patent.
No, it's an old generic drug now, so it's available. I mean, it's out there, and it's patented for Parkinson's disease, and that's what it's sold for. Now we use a lot of old drugs for new purposes, but now somebody could, if you wanted to create a new chemical of it, like if a big pharma wanted to take this chemical, make it ultra safe and ultra more effective, they could patent it for OCD down the road. That's, and that's just the nature of business. I have no problems with that if that's what people want to do. But currently, if this is successful, people could just get it as a generic medication.
But is that the problem, though, that there's not big investment? So you're doing something, and University of Chicago, massive, but you're not GlaxoSmithKline or something. You've not got billions of pounds behind you or dollars. is that the problem, that it is an old drug, so it's not really being advanced in the way it could be?
Well, I think there are several pieces of that, right? As you kind of highlight, maybe bigger companies, they're interested in doing something that's already out there, but they want their share of it, right? So I want my SSRI, your company wants your SSRI, and it doesn't advance science as much as it just kind of repeats what we know. I think part of that, I've never really been sure why OCD is sort of not seen as a viable market by companies, quite frankly. So you highlight 2 to 3% of a population has OCD. There are 40 antidepressants available for depression. And we have literally a handful of drugs for OCD. And the World Health Organization has still listed it as one of the top 10 causes of illness-related disability around the world. So it's a huge burden for people. And it would be lovely if companies were more interested, because I do think that can drive scientific discovery. Whereas when you rely on a few of us at universities to do it, it's sort of people have to find their pennies in the sofa cushions, right, to collect enough money to do a trial. And then, you can only see so many folks and all of this, and good or bad. And people have, there are all sorts of debates about big pharma and things, but they can drive scientific discoveries much faster than individual university researchers can.
Yeah, I've always thought that. So it's the same in the US, Australia, wherever you are, in the UK and Europe. Physical health, treatments of physical health is, they have more money than mental health. So mental health is the poor relation. But within mental health, OCD is the poor relation compared to all these other mental health issues. And I just sort of think the poor relation of the poor relation, it's like that sucks, doesn't it? So let me get on to some questions that have been sent in. Margarita's back in touch. How many of your participants have already had or are currently receiving CBT based on ERP? So CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, for those who are watching and wouldn't know what that is, and ERP, exposure response prevention. So that, and just maybe can you just explain what ERP is?
So ERP is a type of CBT, and it is the sort of gold standard of treatment. You talk about the SSRIs being the sort of the main medication, but if you do head-to-head comparisons, ERP, when well done and very systematically done, in my reading of the literature, always inches out CBT or medication as the preferred treatment. Now, in many places, the problem with ERP is you just need well-trained therapists to do ERP. And it's time intensive. It's often much more work for the patient than it is popping a pill, right? And so some people shy away from it. They find it uncomfortable. But I advise everybody to do ERP, because I'm amazed how many people say, oh, nothing helps my OCD. They do ERP with a well-trained therapist, and it's amazing how much better people can get. And they're like, wow, that's tremendous.
Can you give us an example? So like of contamination, if you have contamination OCD, what would the ERP be, for example?
Yes, and you do a hierarchy of exposures, then that's the exposure piece. So you might start with something that elicits their OCD a little bit, and then you ratchet up. So you might have them touch a doorknob that people have touched, and they don't get to wash their hands, for 30 minutes. They have to sit with it. They realize in most cases the anxiety does sort of ameliorate over time, and that they don't have to engage in their compulsion, because the compulsion will keep the obsession alive. It's kind of like throwing fuel on the fire. And then you may ratchet up, to even more disturbing sort of contamination things, such as touching the toilet bowl, etc. And you can sort of see where there are a myriad of different types of obsessions, right? People can have all sorts of types of obsessions. So they need to do ERP, and the best ERP therapists, I rely on them so much in my work as a psychiatrist. They have to be creative. They have to understand OCD, and they can get amazing results. But for so many people, depending on where they are, their access is so limited to people who are trained in ERP. Having said that, we are allowing people in the study who have done ERP, as long as they've already done it for about 3 to 4 months, because we kind of feel like maybe at that point that they're not going to get a ton of extra benefit from the ERP, so it won't confound the results. But we don't want people to stop their therapy in order to be a part of the study.
Yeah, I think that, sorry, because I asked the question and then I asked you to explain what CBT and ERP is. So it was obviously a very long answer. I think that answers your question, Margarita. And Diana has said, what are your thoughts on the medicine taken with exposure response therapy, which you just answered. So
well, yes, but I will say that this is a brilliant question too from Diana, because what we don't know enough of is the interplay between therapy and medication, meaning if they started ERP, would this medication may accentuate it, may it make it easier to do the ERP? And I would say that would be another piece of that building block. So that's why we're starting with the medication. We're going to see if it gives benefit. Let's say it gives some nice benefit, but not resounding benefit. Diana's question is a perfect follow-up, thinking, well, maybe if it's paired with ERP, meaning I give you the pill, and as it kicks in, I then have you touch the toilet seat, right? And we talk through about, the anxiety reduction and have you use the medication as an augmentation to therapy. That could be a brilliant approach to it. But I think first we have to know if the medication's worth anybody's time.
Yeah. Okay. Just to say that Margarita says yes, thank you. We answered the question. As I asked, have we answered your question? So Margarita, hey, we're really in touch with people all the time, and we're having a conversation with the audience. I tell you one though, that I can't ignore this question because it comes from Made of Millions, who are hosting this webinar. So if I ignored them, I've never been invited back. What are some of the key factors that make a trial successful? It's quite a broad question. Can you answer that?
It is, and I'll tell you, there's probably as much debate about this as there are people out there. It used to be that people took people into trials, say that you had OCD, you could have no other problem, and it had to be the cleanest, you could be on nothing, etc. And that may have been useful at the time, but did that generalize to the world at large, right? People would then say, but I have depression and social anxiety with my OCD. How does that impact? So over time, I think trials have gotten wiser, and they want people in the trials who have other problems, because that's life. And so we don't want folks with OCD who are so sort of perfect and only have one issue, right? That it doesn't make sense to the community of OCD, which often have other comorbidities. So I think you want it to reflect the population at large. I also think you want a trial where clearly people keep coming back, even if it's not helping them. You need people to come back so that, and I try to tell people, look, it really doesn't matter to me. This isn't my grandma's recipe, right? I'm not going to be offended if it doesn't work. What I want to know is scientifically if it works. And so if it doesn't, keep coming back and telling me that it's a pile of crap. I mean, good, I want to know that, but I want to make sure that I keep following you as a clinical trial participant, so that I can not only check your safety, but also, over time realize, maybe it didn't work initially and then you leave me, but it could have worked had we stayed on the medication longer. And so I think you want successful completion of the participants. And I think you just want, participants who have, we don't want, to your point of whether, any of us can get obsessive at some point. We want people who struggle with a problem, because I think a successful trial is about helping people. It's science, but it's also science in furtherance of helping people. So I don't think we want trials of people who, don't struggle with OCD, that it's so minimal, right? That, it's sort of not an issue. So I think you want people who you can, sort of hopefully see an improvement.
Mm. So one of your answers in that, one of the big points that you made during that answer was that it's not your grandmother's recipe or your mother's recipe. And that's interesting, because my perception, I sort of feel like when we meet someone like you, when we have someone like you on the webinar, you sort of think about Tolcapone as your baby. You want it to work, but actually, what you're saying is patients, people who struggle with OCD, that's who you've got at heart here.
Yeah.
And Tolcapone, if it works, that's great. But Tolcapone isn't the thing that you really want to work. It's just that you want to know whether it works or it doesn't.
Yeah.
And that leads me on to my next question. So, why are you passionate about this? Why are you into OCD? What is it that's made you want to do this work?
Well, I think first, that it's, if you meet people with OCD, from anybody who's interested in human psychology, when you meet people with OCD, what you see are people who understand they have a problem and yet can't turn it off on their own. So you see human suffering. And I think if you see that human suffering, I would hope everybody would be interested in that, right? Because somebody's talking to you and say, you know what, I know what you're saying, but right now as we speak, I'm thinking about 10 other things that are so horrific in my head, I'm not going to be paying much attention to you, right? That people have insight, they can actually tell you they're suffering, which I think it makes it all the more palpable. So from my perspective, that I think everybody should be. Now, my personal sort of interest in this, and I had mentioned to you the other day, my mother, God rest her soul, struggled with OCD every day of her life. I think when she was 85, she finally got help for it. A couple of years
That's
before
tragic.
she passed away. Horrible. And not because of some of us not nudging her to get help. It's just there's so much stigma about this. But as a kid growing up in this, I definitely saw, how a perfectly high functioning or for all intents and purposes should have been a high functioning person could, just spend hours almost immobile by OCD, unable to leave a room of the house, unable to leave the house, all of these types of things. So, I think that if you have any personal exposure to it, it makes it all the more sort of palpable that this is just, this isn't lack of willpower by people. This isn't a character flaw. This is people's brain on some hyperdrive. It's actually not even, I would say, distinct from everybody's brain. It's just on hyperdrive. We all worry about irrational things at times. So OCD should be the people that we look to and say, you know what, you actually are just like me, but boy, you got it, to the nth degree. And so, I think it should elicit incredible amounts of human compassion and a desire to change things. And so when I look at patients over the years and know how many people struggle, Tolcapone, I'm always, not just Tolcapone, I'm always trying to think of what else can we do for these folks? Because what we have is good. Don't get me wrong. ERP, SSRIs, good stuff. And everybody should try them, but not good enough.
I mean, that answer, I feel like I want to go back and write it down, because when you're talking about people with OCD and how you want to help people with OCD, and that actually we all struggle with all sorts of things, but it's just not, it's not short circuiting in my brain or your brain. It's not to the nth degree. I mean, there were some great quotes in there. I mean, that feels like that's the reason we should all be fighting to help people with OCD. And yet, as we go back to an earlier part of the webinar, it's the poor relation of the poor relation, and yet it shouldn't be. It should be right up there. We should be spending more money on it. Another question, Made of Millions. As I said, I can't ignore their questions because they are hosting this on their platform. Thank you both for sharing. What do you hope the OCD space looks like in 5 years' time? Actually, I'll add to that, 5 years and 50 years. Can you sort of give us an idea? Is it going to be very different? Because actually, over the last 30 years, given that we're still on we're using SSRIs, and SSRIs were being used 30 years ago, not a great deal has changed. So will it change over the next 5, 50 years?
I wouldn't do this if I weren't almost dim-wittedly optimistic at times. I actually think it can. And I think actually Orchard, other sort of platforms where actually people give a crap about OCD help. So first, what we want to do is get young people with OCD into treatment first, right? We don't want people waiting until they're 85 years old, to get their first treatment. Because what we think too is that the longer you have this, it's just so much more difficult to make a dent in. And so I think that getting younger people into treatment helps end the stigma. And I think stigma is still a huge issue with all mental health problems, but OCD in particular, which can be sort of thought of as not only the poor relation, but also the oddity, a bizarre eccentricity. It's not well sort of understood in terms of its depth of struggle. But I also think that the more that we just invest in mental health across the board, even if OCD takes the trickle down effects, right? I mean, it does provide us better information. And I'm hoping that we'll get to the point where somebody can walk in and say, I have OCD, boom, boom, boom. They'll answer the questions that they always answer. And maybe it's spit, maybe it's blood, it's something. Maybe it's cognitive testing. And I'll say, boom, 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 based on this algorithm, this medication or this therapy is going to be effective 95% of the time versus somebody else who has a different algorithm. I'm hoping we can get to that. Now, 5 years, 10 years, I'm not going anywhere. So I'm in, it's fine with me if it takes longer, if it's done right.
So 5 years, there could be a change, you think? It could be a different landscape, or is it longer than that?
I think we could have more options. I think the personalized medicine, as they call it, where we really know on an individual level, that may take longer. But I'm hoping we can have more options than just SSRIs.
Okay, I just want to get to this question because I don't know whether Lisa's still there, but she says, thank you, really interesting. Need to leave now for a psychiatrist appointment, being referred for neurosurgery after 50 years of OCD. And then she goes on, I hope this is really successful and saves others from distress, as the distress so many of us have struggled through. Now, when you hear that, that's going to give you the fire in the belly to find more. If it's not Tolcapone, it's something else. I mean, I sort of feel a little bit tearful hearing that. 50 years she struggled. And that's just so tragic, isn't it? You talked about your mother, 83 years. It's so tragic. There are people who are struggling with this when actually surely we must be able to do something about it.
And as you say, we make such inroads in cancer and other types of health issues, in part because, and one doesn't want to be a broken record about funding, but because people put the money there, and as a collective society, people say cancer's horrible, right? And I think we need that kind of collective society to say a lot of mental health issues are not just something to sweep under the rug, that they're actually horrible and people struggle. And yes, it brings tears to my eyes too, thinking that after 50 years is a lot of friggin' hours to be obsessing. It's also a lot of life missed. I mean, I talk to people who get better, say in their 30s, and they've already had OCD even for 10 years. I was chatting with this person who told me that his first date at 35 years of age. And it was so moving because adolescence, young adulthood just derailed completely. So
I'm going to cut across you a bit because I know Lisa's got to go, and I just sort of feel like we're having a conversation with Lisa because she's messaging in 3 minutes to go. 10 medications, 30 years of therapy, psilocybin, inpatient, nothing changes. Yeah. So that's just, so Lisa, we wish you all the best. And there are so many people like you, so you're not alone. And there are a few people like Professor Jon Grant who are doing everything they can to try and change that. So let's just hope that we can just give them a boost to do it. And let's hope that things like the Tolcapone trial, or if it's something else, we're not saying it's going to be Tolcapone, but that we can get an armory of things so that something works. If this A doesn't work, B will work. If B doesn't work, C will work, and so on and so forth. So, gosh, I feel like it's just the three of us with Lisa. Lisa says, thank you, really love this. Also, Nick has messaged, fantastic webinar, John and Sean. Actually, Nick's from Orchard. He's sort of my boss, so that's great. So there's a tick for both of us there. John, I mean, we haven't got long. I just wanted to really briefly ask you, can OCD and your studies with OCD and what other people like you are doing, can that teach us other things about other compulsive disorders? I'm thinking like things like addiction, maybe gambling habits and things like that. Can you do that in 2 minutes?
I think there are lots of overlap, right? Our brain is very complicated, but there's a lot of similarities. Another area, autism. Autistic folks often have very kind of compulsive ritualized behaviors as well. So I think research in OCD has the ability to fan out to a lot of other things. It doesn't have to be an isolated thing when people say, oh, it's just OCD. It tells us a lot about how the brain functions, and that can tell us a lot about other mental health problems.
Brilliant. So the future, I was going to say the future looks bright. The future could look bright, and there are things that could be done. We're sort of relying on you. I don't want to put the pressure on your shoulders. There's lots of people like you, but there are a lot of people, as you can tell from Lisa, who really need this help. And it's brilliant the work you do. So just a couple of thanks before we go. We've got about 30 seconds. I just want to say thank you to everyone who's watched and people who've sent questions in. You're the people who make this. So thank you very much indeed. Professor Jon Grant, it's a pleasure, absolute pleasure talking to you. And I think that mix of you being the scientist, you being the person who is leading this trial, but also the personal, being personal and talking to us about your childhood and your mother and what you went through, all of that we are incredibly grateful for. So I thank you very much for joining us. And I suppose the other thanks is to Made of Millions and Orchard for allowing us to host this webinar. So thank you all very much indeed. We're up to an hour, so I think we probably better go. John, thank you, and thanks to everyone.